Park Ranger David Miles vanished from the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Arrowhead National Park in the autumn of 1989. One moment he was on patrol, a steadfast guardian of the mountains. The next, he was gone. His truck was found, his lunch uneaten on the passenger seat, but of David there was no trace. No note, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie silence that settled over the pines like a shroud. For 10 long years, his disappearance was a phantom that haunted the park, a story told in hushed tones around campfires, a wound that never healed for his family. The case was a perfect mystery, sealed by time and wilderness. 10 years later, a team of geologists studying bat colonies would venture deep into a cave system, miles from where David was last seen. They weren't looking for a missing person. They weren't investigating a crime. But a strange reading on their equipment would lead them to a false wall of rock, one that seemed almost man-made. And what they found behind it would not only solve the decade-old mystery of the vanished ranger, but would also unearth a conspiracy of greed and corruption so dark it had been buried in the heart of the mountain itself. David Miles was, by all accounts, a man who had found his place in the world. At 34, he was strong, quiet, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the natural world he had sworn to protect. He wasn't just a ranger, he was a part of Arrowhead National Park, as much as the ancient sequoias or the granite peaks. His colleagues respected him for his encyclopedic knowledge of the backcountry and his unshakable calm in the face of the unexpected, whether it was a lost hiker or a sudden blizzard. He had a dry wit that would surface at the end of a long shift, and a gentle patience that made him a favorite among the park's visitors. But his true north, the compass that guided his life, was his family. He had met his wife Sarah, a librarian from the nearby town, during a talk he gave on wildfire prevention. She was captivated by his passion, by the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about the delicate balance of the forest ecosystem. They married a year later, their small house at the edge of the park becoming a sanctuary, filled with the smell of pine needles and old books. Their daughter, Emily, was born 2 years after that. She was just 5 years old when her father disappeared, a bright, curious child who was the center of David's universe. He was teaching her the names of constellations, pointing out the Big Dipper from their back porch on clear nights. He'd carry her on his shoulders during short hikes, showing her the difference between a sugar pine and a ponderosa, letting her feel the rough bark. One of Sarah's most cherished memories was finding David and Emily sitting on the living room floor, meticulously studying a map of the park. He was tracing a trail with his finger, telling her, "This is where the eagles nest, Em. One day, when you're big enough, we'll hike all the way up there and watch them fly." That was his core ambition, to raise his daughter to love and respect the wild, to build a simple, meaningful life with the woman he loved, and to protect the land that gave him so much purpose. The emotional stakes were not grand or complex. They were profound in their simplicity. It was the promise of watching his daughter grow up, of growing old with his wife, of countless more nights under the stars. The life that was interrupted was not just one of an anonymous park ranger. It was the life of a devoted husband and a loving father, a life rich with small, irreplaceable moments and a future that seemed as vast and promising as the park itself. That was the life that vanished without a trace, leaving behind a silence that would echo for a decade. The morning of October 12, 1989, began like any other. David drank his coffee while watching the sun rise over the jagged peaks, the air crisp with the coming winter. He kissed Sarah and a still sleepy Emily goodbye, promising to be home in time for dinner. His assignment for the day was a routine patrol of the park's northern boundary, a remote and rugged area known as Sentinel Ridge. It was a full day's work, checking on trail conditions, monitoring for illegal hunting camps, and ensuring the wilderness remained undisturbed. He checked in with the main ranger station via radio at 9 a.m., his voice calm and clear. "Station Alpha, this is Ranger 1, all clear at the trailhead. Beginning patrol of Sector 4. Weather's holding for now." Hank, the senior ranger on duty, logged the call without a second thought. But as the day wore on, the sky began to curdle. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in from the west, clinging to the mountainsides. The wind picked up, whistling through the canyons. This was a classic autumn storm, the kind that could turn a pleasant hike into a life-or-death struggle in a matter of hours. At 2:15 p.m., David's voice crackled over the radio again, this time with a different edge to it. "Station Alpha. Seeing some activity near the old quarry. A Ridgeview truck. They're way off their survey markers." Ridgeview Development was a constant thorn in the park's side, a powerful company that had been aggressively pushing to acquire land along the park's border for a luxury resort. They were known for cutting corners and bending rules. Hank told David to document it, but not to engage. "Just take photos, Dave. Don't be a hero. A big storm's blowing in fast. Get back to the truck and head in." The radio crackled with static. "Copy that," David said, his voice faint. "Something feels off up here, Hank. I'm going to take a quick look around the cave system, over and out." That was the last anyone ever heard from him. The decision to take that quick look, to follow his ranger's intuition instead of heading directly for safety, was a fatal mistake. He was venturing closer to a secret he wasn't meant to find, under the cover of a gathering storm that would soon erase any evidence of what happened next. The first sign of trouble was the silence. David was meticulous about his check-ins, especially when the weather turned. When 4 p.m. passed with no word, Hank at Station Alpha began to feel a knot tighten in his stomach. He tried the radio again and again. "Ranger 1, this is Station Alpha. Do you copy?" Only static answered. An hour later, as dusk began to bleed into the stormy sky, the protocol was clear. Hank dispatched another ranger, a young man named Ben, to drive up to the Sentinel Ridge trailhead where David had parked his truck. The drive was tense, rain now lashing against the windshield. Ben found the Forest Service truck exactly where it should be, parked near the sign for the cave trail. But the scene was immediately wrong. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the dome light was on. On the passenger seat sat a brown paper bag containing a sandwich and an apple, David's uneaten lunch. His heavy-duty flashlight was on the dashboard, but his handheld radio lay on the floor mat. Its casing cracked as if it had been dropped. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. He called out, "David! David Miles!" His voice was swallowed by the wind and the drumming rain. He swept his flashlight beam across the muddy ground around the truck. He saw overlapping boot prints, but the downpour was quickly turning the earth into a soupy mess, destroying any clear tracks. Then his light caught a glint of metal near the front tire. He knelt down and saw it, a single spent 12-gauge shotgun shell. It was brass, not the kind of shell used for hunting deer or birds in the region. It was out of place. A cold dread washed over him. He scrambled back to his own truck, his hands shaking as he keyed the radio. Transcript of the call to the county sheriff's department captured the rising panic. "Sheriff's dispatch. This is Ranger Ben Carter at Arrowhead. I'm at the Sentinel Ridge trailhead. I've found Ranger David Miles's vehicle. It's abandoned. Door open. No sign of him. Repeat, no sign of Ranger Miles. And listen, I think you need to get someone up here right away. Something is very, very wrong." The inciting incident wasn't a scream or a struggle. It was the chilling discovery of a life abruptly paused, leaving behind only questions and the quiet prelude to a decade of mystery. The official search for David Miles began the next morning, a massive operation fighting against a hostile environment. The storm that had rolled in the previous afternoon had unleashed its full fury overnight, dumping nearly a foot of rain in the high country. Creeks overflowed their banks, trails became treacherous rivers of mud, and a thick, disorienting fog clung to the mountains, making visibility near zero. Despite the conditions, a small army of first responders descended on Arrowhead National Park. Park rangers, sheriff's deputies, and over 200 civilian volunteers combed the area, their bright rain gear a stark contrast to the grim gray landscape. Search dogs were brought in, but the torrential rain had washed away any potential scent trail within hours of David's disappearance. Helicopters remained grounded for 3 full days, their pilots staring helplessly at the impenetrable cloud ceiling. The initial search focused on the theory that David, caught in the storm, had fallen or sought shelter and succumbed to the elements. But the rangers who knew him, who knew his expertise, found this hard to believe. David was not a novice. He was a seasoned professional who respected the weather. The single shotgun shell found by his truck was logged as evidence, but largely dismissed by the lead investigator, Sheriff Brody. Brody was a gruff, old-school lawman on the verge of retirement. and he seemed fixated on the accident theory. He publicly declared, "We have a man lost in a terrible storm. Our focus is on finding him, not chasing down wild goose chases about foul play." This created an immediate and palpable friction. David's fellow Rangers, led by Hank, felt the sheriff was ignoring crucial red flags. They pointed to the Ridgeview development truck David had reported, but Brody claimed to have spoken with the company, who assured him their crews had left the area hours before the storm hit. David's wife, Sarah, frantic with worry, tried to press the sheriff about David's concerns over the developers, but she was treated with a patronizing tone and told to let the professionals do their work. The family's frustration mounted with each passing day. The search was vast but unfocused. Teams scoured canyons and ridges, but the terrain was a labyrinth of rock and forest. The bad weather wasn't just an obstacle, it felt like an antagonist, actively working to conceal the truth. On the fifth day, tragedy struck the search itself. A volunteer, a local man who had known David for years, slipped on a wet rock face and suffered a compound fracture, requiring a dangerous low-altitude airlift. The incident cast a pall over the entire operation, draining morale and resources. After 10 grueling days with no new leads and the weather still hampering efforts, Sheriff Brody officially called off the large-scale search. He held a press conference announcing with grim finality that Ranger David Miles was presumed to be a tragic victim of the storm. For the family, it was a devastating blow. They felt the investigation had been bungled, the search called off prematurely, and their concerns deliberately ignored. The failure wasn't just a result of bad luck or bad weather. It felt orchestrated, a deliberate shutting of the door on a case that someone, somewhere, did not want solved. With the official search concluded, the case of David Miles went cold. The file was placed in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, where it gathered dust. Sheriff Brody retired the following year, and the institutional memory of the case began to fade. But for David's family and the community, the mystery lingered like a chronic illness. The passage of years did nothing to dull the pain of not knowing. Sarah Miles raised Emily in the shadow of the mountains that had taken her husband. Every time she looked out her window at the peaks, she was confronted by the great unanswered question. She became a quiet, haunted figure in town. Her grief, a constant, silent presence. Emily grew from a small child into a teenager who knew her father only through photographs and stories. She grew up with a ghost, a heroic but absent figure whose loss defined her childhood. The lack of closure was a unique and cruel form of torture, preventing the family from ever truly moving on. In the park itself, David's story became a permanent part of the landscape. The trail where his truck was found was unofficially known as Miles's Ridge. New rangers were told the story of the veteran who walked into the woods and never came back. It became a cautionary tale, a piece of grim local folklore. Some hikers claimed to see a lone figure in a ranger's uniform watching them from the trees, the Ghost Ranger of Arrowhead, forever patrolling his territory. His vanishing was no longer just a cold case. It was a legend, a mystery woven into the fabric of the place he had loved. The initial shock and panic of his disappearance curdled, over the years, into a deep-seated and pervasive hopelessness. The world had moved on, but for those who loved him, time was frozen on that stormy October day in 1989. The truth, it seemed, was lost forever, buried somewhere in the unforgiving wilderness, as unreachable as David himself. For 10 years, that hopelessness held firm. The case was a sealed chapter, a local tragedy that everyone had accepted would never be solved. The catalyst that finally broke it open came not from a determined detective or a new piece of evidence, but from a place of pure scientific curiosity, completely disconnected from the past. In the summer of 1999, a team of graduate students and professors from a state university's geology department arrived at Arrowhead National Park. Their project had nothing to do with cold cases. They were there to map the park's extensive and poorly understood cave systems to study hibernating bat populations. Armed with ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging equipment, they began their survey in the same remote northern sector where David had vanished a decade earlier. Deep inside a cavern known to local cavers as the Echo Chamber, one of the students noticed an anomaly on his screen. Behind a solid-looking limestone wall at the very back of the main passage, the equipment was showing a void, a hollow space approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet high. It made no geological sense. The rock formation should have been solid. Intrigued, the lead professor, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, decided to investigate. Suspecting a hidden, sealed-off passage, the team obtained permission from the Park Service to use minimal, precise explosive charges, a common technique in geological exploration, to breach the wall. They drilled small holes, placed the charges, and retreated to a safe distance. The blast was a muffled boom that echoed through the cavern. When the dust settled, they saw a dark, gaping hole where a solid wall had been moments before. A wave of musty, stagnant air washed over them. One of the students aimed a high-powered flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the black and landed on something on the floor of the newly revealed chamber. It wasn't a rock or a bat. It was a dark brown leather satchel, covered in a thick layer of dust and mold, but unmistakably man-made. With a surge of adrenaline and caution, Dr. Finch carefully entered the small chamber. He knelt and gently unbuckled the rotted straps of the satchel. Inside, protected from the elements, was a spiral-bound notebook. Its cover was damp, but the writing inside was still legible. On the first page, in neat, strong handwriting, were the words, "Ranger David Miles, Logbook, Arrowhead National Park." The pivotal moment had arrived, not with a shout, but with the quiet turning of a page. The long-dead case was suddenly, shockingly alive. The discovery of the journal was an earthquake that shook the dormant case to its foundations. The sheriff's department was forced to reopen the investigation, assigning it to a sharp, tenacious young detective named Isabella Rossi. Rossi, who was only a teenager when David vanished, had no ties to the old guard or the original bungled investigation. For her, this was not a piece of local folklore. It was a fresh crime scene. Her first act was to read David's journal cover to cover. The final entries were chilling. David wrote with increasing alarm about his suspicions regarding Ridgeview development. He had documented seeing their trucks far inside park boundaries on multiple occasions, and he'd found evidence of what he suspected was illegal chemical dumping near the cave systems. His last entry, dated October 12, 1989, was a bombshell. He wrote, "Saw the Ridgeview truck again, parked near the echo chamber. Foreman Carl Veneto was with another man, going to confront them. This has to stop. Something feels wrong. I suspect Sheriff Brody is turning a blind eye for a reason." The journal transformed the narrative from a tragic accident into a potential conspiracy and murder. The newly discovered chamber became a forensic goldmine. Detective Rossi sealed off the area and brought in a state forensic anthropology team. The meticulous, inch-by-inch excavation of the chamber floor began. It didn't take long. Buried under a few feet of dirt and rock, they found it. A human skeleton. The tattered remains of a park ranger uniform clung to the bones. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. This was David Miles. An autopsy of the skeletal remains revealed a cluster of small, circular holes in the ribcage, consistent with a close-range shotgun blast. The murder weapon was found buried nearby, a rusty 12-gauge shotgun. Ballistics tests were a perfect match for the single shell casing found next to David's truck 10 years prior. But the cave held one more secret. As the team expanded their search, they found a second, shallower grave just a few yards away, containing another set of human remains. This individual had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Armed with the journal and the new forensic evidence, Rossi began relentlessly pursuing the leads. She first visited the retired Sheriff Brody, now an old man living a quiet life. When confronted with a copy of David's journal entry, Brody became agitated, denying everything with a tremor in his voice. Next, Rossi located Carl Veneto. The former Ridgeview foreman now owned a small, struggling construction company. Rossi found him on a job site. She didn't ask questions, she simply handed him a copy of David's final damning entry. Veneto's face went pale. He stared at the words, the accusation from the grave, and he crumbled. In a lengthy, detailed confession at the station, the entire truth spilled out. Veneto admitted that he and another Ridgeview employee, a man named Frank Miller, were dumping barrels of toxic industrial waste into the cave system to save the company millions. David Miles had stumbled upon them, catching them in the act. An argument erupted. David was going to report them. Miller, in a moment of pure panic, grabbed the shotgun they kept in the truck for security and shot David. Veneto, knowing his life was over if this got out, helped Miller drag David's body deep into the cave. They used a small backhoe from their truck to pile rocks and dirt over a narrow opening, sealing him in. The plan was almost perfect. But Frank Miller became a liability. He was a nervous wreck, consumed by guilt and drinking heavily. Veneto was terrified he would confess. About a week later, he lured Miller back to the caves under the pretense of making sure the body was still hidden. When Miller's back was turned, Veneto shot him and buried him nearby. The mystery of the second body was solved. It was a desperate, brutal act to ensure a final, absolute silence. The confession of Carl Veneto sent shockwaves through the county. The gears of justice, frozen for a decade, began to grind with furious speed. Veneto was arrested and charged with the murder of David Miles and Frank Miller. Based on his confession and the corroborating evidence from David's journal, a warrant was issued for the arrest of former Sheriff Brody. The sight of the frail, elderly ex-lawman being led away in handcuffs was a stunning conclusion to a saga of long-buried corruption. The why behind it all was laid bare, and it was as ugly and common as expected: greed. Ridgeview Development, in its ruthless pursuit of profit, had been systematically breaking environmental laws, and David Miles was an unacceptable obstacle. Sheriff Brody, it was revealed through old bank records Rossi unearthed, had received substantial and untraceable consulting fees from a shell corporation owned by Ridgeview. His role was to be their protector, to ensure any local troubles were smoothed over. When David vanished, Brody did his job perfectly. He immediately took control of the narrative, pushing the "lost in the storm" theory from the first hour. He dismissed the shotgun shell, ignored Hank's and Sarah's pleas to investigate Ridgeview, and shut down the search as soon as he plausibly could. He buried the truth under a pile of bureaucratic procedure and feigned sympathy. The entire conspiracy was exposed. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated business decision. David Miles wasn't killed by a panicked man. He was executed because he was an honest man standing in the way of money. The legal fallout was immense. With Veneto's testimony, federal investigators launched a probe into the now defunct Ridgeview Development, uncovering a history of fraud, bribery, and environmental crimes that led to the indictment of 2 of its former executives. The full sordid story was finally public, a tale of how a good man's life was traded for profit and hidden by the very person sworn to protect him. With the arrests made and the conspiracy exposed, the focus of the story shifted away from the cold, hard facts of the investigation and back to the human heart of the tragedy. Detective Rossi felt her duty was not complete until she had spoken to Sarah and Emily Miles. She drove to their house, the same small home that still looked out at the mountains. Instead of just delivering the news, she brought something with her: David's original journal. She sat with Sarah and a now 16-year-old Emily at their kitchen table and handed it to them. For the first time, they could hear David's voice, not as a memory, but in his final, courageous hours. They read about his love for the park, his frustration with the developers, and his determination to do the right thing. It was a final, painful gift. The revelation brought a complex storm of emotions. There was a fresh wave of grief, the raw pain of knowing for certain he had been murdered, his life violently stolen. But beneath it, there was also a profound and powerful sense of relief. The crushing weight of a decade of not knowing was finally lifted. The ghost that had haunted their home was gone. Emily, who had only known her father as a fading photograph and a sad story, could now see him as a hero. He wasn't just a man who had disappeared. He was a man who had made a stand. The uncertainty that had poisoned their lives for so long was replaced by the terrible but clean finality of truth. A few weeks later, a proper funeral was held for David Miles. His remains were finally laid to rest in the town cemetery. It was a quiet, somber service attended by his family, old friends, and a new generation of park rangers. They stood in silence as a bugler played taps, the mournful notes echoing towards the peaks of Arrowhead, the park he had died to protect. Sarah Miles could finally mourn her husband. The case of Ranger David Miles ultimately became more than just a solved murder. It grew into a powerful lesson on the quiet, enduring conflict between integrity and corruption. His story was a stark reminder that the deepest evils are often not born from monstrous passion, but from the simple, callous greed of powerful people who see others as obstacles to be removed. But it was also a testament to the idea that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried or how long it lies dormant, can find its way to the light. David's sacrifice was not in vain. The scandal that erupted from his rediscovered journal forced a complete overhaul of local government and its relationship with corporate interests. New, stringent environmental protection policies were implemented for lands bordering national parks across the state. More importantly, it led to the creation of the Ranger Protection Act, a piece of legislation that provided stronger whistleblower protections for park employees who report illegal activities. His personal stand created a legacy of accountability. Arrowhead National Park honored him by creating the David Miles Memorial Trail. It winds its way up to Sentinel Ridge, ending at a scenic overlook with a simple bronze plaque. The plaque doesn't just state his name and dates, it tells the story of his final heroic act. It ensures that future generations of visitors will know that the peace and beauty of the park were defended by a man of immense courage. The legacy of David Miles is not one of victimhood, but of enduring principle. A devoted park ranger and loving father was silenced by greed and buried by corruption. But a decade later, the very earth he swore to protect revealed his final, heroic secret. If this story of courage and corruption moved you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing for more true crime mysteries that deserve to be told. And tell us in the comments, do you believe justice was fully served in the case of David Miles?